morning, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you, as well as our colleagues from IUCN and CRLM. The Stimson Center is located in Washington, D.C., and our team, the Southeast Asia program, has been engaging on Mekong transboundary water issues and water energy issues for more than 10 years. Some of you might know our distinguished former director, Richard Cronin, Dr. Richard Cronin, who has visited here many times and spoke with you last year. And he sends his best regards. He has now retired, but has not left the Stimson Center, has not left his interest in the Mekong region, and has not stopped engaging. He's just taking more time off from his duties at Stimson and is now a senior distinguished fellow for the Stimson Center. And he asked me to send his best regards. I'm the director of our program, and I've been working on Mekong issues and researching Mekong issues, starting with an early focus on China-Southeast Asia engagement well over 10 years ago, and lived in China for more than 15 years before moving to the Stimson Center to work with this great team, which includes Dr. Richard Cronin and my colleague Courtney Weatherby beside me. And recently filled Dr. Cronin's shoes, which are big shoes to fill. I'm not sure if that translates well into Vietnamese, in the role of director. And we are here to promote alternatives, to challenge you to think differently about the future of the Mekong, and to think about sustainable ways forward through this very complex issue of transboundary water management and energy development in the region. So to start out, Courtney and I are going to present some of the main points from our new publication, which is one of our first country-focused publications. It's called A Call for Strategic Basin-wide Energy Planning in Laos. Now don't be fooled that this is only about Laos, because it's about the entire region. There are regional implications for what Laos is doing, and our sets of policy recommendations at the back are targeted towards not just what Laos should do, but what Vietnam should consider as well as what the United States can do with its deepening engagement in the region through the rebalance to the Asia Pacific, as well as through its currently deepening engagement in Laos, which is a very new development and is something that we'd like to talk to you about. Before I hand the mic over to my colleague Courtney, I'd like to just discuss three aspects, three realizations that we'd like to get across during this morning of discussion, and hear feedback from you during our discussion after the presentation. And one is that these realizations are kind of paradigm shifts or suggestions of ways to change our thinking about what's happening in the region with development of the Mekong and the Mekong River. And one is that some of you may have heard that the Pak Baby Dam is now under preparation. This is a dam site that is above Luang Prabang. It's above the large Sayaburi Dam on the mainstream of the Mekong. There has been no announcement about the official construction starting on the Pak Baby Dam. Certainly no official construction has happened, and this is something that we've learned last week on our trip to Laos. However, the roads are built, the construction crews are beginning to move in, the bridge is built across the river, things are ready to go with this dam. And we've heard that the announcement for notification from the Lao government to the Mekong River Commission is imminent. So this is happening soon. So with the standard approach of thinking about the future of the river and as dams are going up on the river, our shift of attention will probably begin to go from the Don Sahom dam site, which I see all of you have a flyer on, to the Pak Baby Dam. And there's nothing wrong with focusing attention and pressure on these individual projects. This pressure and attention has worked from a regional scale and a global scale. It has changed the nature of these projects and changed the way that these projects impact downstream countries like Cambodia and Vietnam. In Cyberbury, there have been the additions of fish mitigation efforts. We don't know if it's going to work, but what is being put in there is much, much better than the original design. And last week, Courtney and I visited the Don Sahong Dam site to learn that we were under the impression that the fish mitigation efforts there were kind of limited and only dedicated to 2 natural channels, digging out 2 natural channels of the Mekong at the Sipandon region. But our visit revealed that there are actually 7 natural channels being prepared for fish mitigation. This was a surprise to us. We're not sure what the results will be because the dam has yet to go into operation. But this is, again, a much better approach than what we had thought and what we had initially envisioned for this. So the pressure on individual projects is causing them to change. It's causing developers and governments to take a new look and to change their ways about going about developing these projects. However, this focus on individual projects, I think, is worrisome because it takes our eyes away from some other very critical things that are happening. We hear a lot about mainstream dams, Don Sahong, Cyberbury, Pak Baby Dam. Why do we hear a lot about them? Because those are the big projects on the river. Those are they are said to be the most impactful projects on the river. And at the same time, the Mekong River Commission, the focus of the Mekong River Commission is dedicated to those dams. But what is happening is actually something much larger. The focus on individual projects takes us away from attention to tributary cascades. And I'm going to show, here it is. This map here shows kind of the bigger picture, and this is the larger picture that I hope that we can begin to think about. That damming in the Mekong is not just about 9 planned dams on the mainstream. It's about 100 plus projects, all of them higher than 15 megawatts, and some of them much larger than that, happening over the course of 30 years, being developed over the course of 30 years. So there are projects on tributaries such as the Namu River, the Nam Ta River, Nam Nguyen River, that are going up without any attention and any pressure from the international community. And so this is something we need to begin to focus on. Also, only focusing on individual projects, it takes our eyes off of the long-term plan, or thinking about how much of this plan has actually manifested to date. And our assessment is that it's still very much early. Despite 2 decades of efforts of damming the river, very few dams have been built on the river compared to the inventory of dams out there, which is this, as well as the projected final goal, or what we perceive as the final goal of the Lao government. So within this larger picture, or kind of a basin scale development, we see that there is time. There's time to think creatively, there's time to rethink this picture here in ways that are beneficial for not only Laos, but also Vietnam. And that gets to my second kind of realization that I hope we can understand. And unfortunately, that realization is Laos is not going to stop its approach to damming the river. Laos needs to have a reason for being within the region. It needs to have inflows of hard currency to support its economic development. And it set its goals on hydropower. Things are changing, things are in flux in Laos in terms of the perception of how much hydropower will actually deliver to the national income of the country over time. But Laos will not move away from this. So despite best efforts, it's still always going to be there. But what is actually there might change. So the number of dams might change. The approach to damming the river might change. And the approach, very importantly, to what is generating the income for energy production can change. And this is a message that I hope we can share with you, that Laos has potential not just for hydropower, but for other renewable energies. And those renewable energies can be sold to Vietnam. For example, solar and wind, large potential in solar, 8,000 megawatts, wind not as high, but still a potential. And these energies can work in a complementary fashion to work together to have Laos become the battery of Asia. Another reality that, in terms of economic development, is that energy demand in Vietnam is growing fast, and my colleague Courtney is going to discuss this. So somewhere along the way, the goals of Laos being the battery of Asia and Vietnam's energy demand are going to converge. And we need to either think creatively about how to work together with these two goals, or we can ignore the problem, or we can protest. But I think in the end, the end result is still going to be working together between Laos and Vietnam for a future that has more energy coming from Laos to Vietnam. But that energy doesn't have to just be hydropower. And it doesn't have to be hydropower from projects that have devastating effects on the Mekong Delta. So we can think creatively about where dams are sited. We can change this map. We can think creatively about the kinds of energy that's coming out of Laos. And we can think creatively about the kinds of dams that don't hold water back from the Mekong Delta, but let water flow through and promote these kinds of dams in sites that aren't as damaging to the downstream countries. And the final realization, and I think I've already mentioned it, is that there's still time to engage on this. We look at some stats. We'll go back to some of these slides. But currently, out of 140 projects in the Laos inventory for dam building, only 29 have been completed. And these are larger dams of over 15 megawatts. Currently under construction, 26%. But what's following, there are many, many more. So it's early days, as we say in the United States. It's early days for dam development in Laos. And within this context, we also have to realize that there currently is no plan for damming the Mekong in Laos. And this is one of our greatest realizations through our conversations with the Ministry of Energy and Mines. We do a lot of engagement with governments in the region, particularly in Laos, Ministry of Energy and Mines, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, and the Lao National Mekong Commission. And our assessment and what is actually being said by these ministries is there's no plan for how these dams are going to be built into the future, how many dams will actually be built in the basin. We asked directly, what is the final target? Do you want to get 18 gigawatts, 24 gigawatts? This is a 24 gigawatt statistic here. They don't know. There's no final goal. So we can see this as either kind of a very confusing situation, a frustrating situation, or one in which there are many opportunities. It's still early days to assist Laos with planning. And this is something that is going on right now because the government in Laos has realized that the approach of facilitating the needs of individual investors, foreign investors from Vietnam, from China, from Thailand, is an approach that keeps them too busy thinking about individual dam projects and not being able to see the big picture, not being able to look at the longer horizon, and not being able to, very importantly, coordinate between projects. There are projects on tributaries in Laos that are very close to each other and built and operated by the same developer. But this year, the drought has caused a situation where the downstream dam is not getting enough water from the upstream dam because water releases are not coordinated. And if we blow that up to the large scale to think about if 2 dams on tributaries cannot coordinate amongst themselves, how will 100 do it? How will 70 do it? And currently, we believe Laos is realizing this, that there's a need for coordination, and calling out to agencies in the United States and to other donor countries for assistance in coordinating and optimizing the amount of power that's coming out of the basin. And within this, there's a role for Vietnam. And we're going to talk about that later at the end of our presentation. But I'm going to shift now to my colleague Courtney, who will discuss some of the main points of our new narrative concept, which is a concept that suggests that instead of, as each dam goes up on the river, it makes it easier for the next dam to come up. We believe that Laos and Cambodia and countries that are damming the Mekong are actually running into more troubles to bring the next dam online. And this is a process that slows the process down. So as the process is slowing, more risks are being revealed, more issues are being revealed, and these are issues with which we can engage and promote better coordination and cooperation. Courtney.
Thank you, Brian. So Brian already discussed a little bit about the new narrative. I'm not going to get into too much detail on it because we had a full report on that came out last year. But essentially it's looking at the financial and political risks for individual projects, looking at what happened with the Dam Sahong and Sayaburi projects from pressure from civil society, international community, and just the general economic pressures that we see. So instead of going into too much detail on that report, I'm going to discuss 4 factors that we've seen in addition to those over this last year that are included in this report. And the first of those are the repercussions from the 2015 to 2016 drought, which was caused by the El Nino effect. And of course, we've seen the impact in the Mekong Delta here in Vietnam. And that has also impacted the other countries in the basin. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the water diversion challenges because I know that's the focal points of Mr. Kwong's presentation later. But essentially, the concerns over the drought, the impacts on food security, the impacts on operation of individual projects in Laos, and cascade projects in Laos tributary basin, have raised concerns over water tensions into focus of the public conversation about water management in the region. And this is significant primarily because this drought is a foreteller of things that will be coming in the future under climate change. The predicted impacts tend to focus on greater intensity of individual events, so you'll see more flooding, and then also drought because you're going to see longer time with no rain or less rain, which will both of these will pose significant challenges to hydropower. And as Brian said, that's something we're starting to see recognized by some officials in Laos. The second factor is the rise of Myanmar as an investment location for hydropower. Myanmar has almost 4 times as much potential for hydropower as Laos does. They've got about 100,000 megawatts. They also have significant natural gas reserves, significant solar potential. And in the past, because of sanctions from Western governments, many companies have been hesitant to invest in these projects in Myanmar. And so Myanmar's rivers, the Irrawaddy and the Salween, remain relatively underdeveloped. There's just not been a lot of investment in those projects that's moved forward. And so at this point in time, with Myanmar's transition of government to civilian democracy and the opening up of the economy, we're seeing an influx of interest from investors, from multinational development banks, and from donor countries. And oftentimes, these are countries which had previously focused on Mekong hydropower in Laos. So we're now seeing a shift of interest, for instance, from the IFC to do a strategic environmental assessment of hydropower in Myanmar, looking at the feasibility of a strategic plan and of investment in Myanmar's hydropower. We're seeing a number of companies shifting over there, many of which are Thai and Chinese companies that have also invested in projects in Laos. And essentially, this just raises competition. Myanmar right now is a country that is potentially in need of energy from Laos on the border in Shan State, but in the long term, they're going to be a competitor for investments, for capacity building support, and for energy markets in Southeast Asia for Laos. And so we're seeing a shift of interest. The third major factor, we've got a PowerPoint. Is looking at the economic slowdown in China, which is something we started looking at last year, China's economic growth has dropped significantly in the last few years. Previously China had been operating at double-digit growth of 10% or more per year. We've seen that drop down to what is now projected to be between 4.5 and 6.5% growth this year. And this is a concern because China has provided the majority of the funding for these tributary projects and some of the mainstream projects on the Mekong River and the Mekong Basin in Laos. There's increasing concern from the Chinese government about the risks of non-performing loans, many of which are tied to investments domestically but also abroad in infrastructure, including in hydropower. This is largely because in China we're seeing a significant rise in the debt to GDP ratio. The spread of an underground unregulated shadow banking system where there is really no risk analysis for loans, and 18 months of a slow and steady rise in the recognition that there are bad debts that will simply not be paid back. And again, many of these are for state-owned enterprises that are investing in infrastructure projects, both domestically and abroad. So moving forward, this is impacting the risk analysis of major Chinese funders, including both policy banks like the China Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank. And it's also impacting the risk perceptions of the development companies themselves, specifically groups like Sino Hydro, and other Chinese companies that have invested a great deal abroad. For hydropower projects and any other large infrastructure projects, these are considerably risky in countries where you've got potential political pushback, as we've seen happening in Myanmar, for instance with the Viet Sông Dam, in Cambodia with the Irrigation Dam, and of course with any of the mainstream and large tributary projects, which are viewed as very impactful by downstream countries like Cambodia and Vietnam. So long-term payback for these projects can be risky because they require significant upfront costs. The profit margins are returned over a long period of time. If it's a large project like Shea Buri, it takes years to build, and then it will take more than a decade of operation to start making back the money that these companies have invested in the project. There are long-term maintenance costs with these projects, particularly if they were not designed with sufficient fisheries and sediment mitigation. As those pressures continue to rise, the companies will be forced to respond, as we saw they did with Shea Buri and Don Sahong, shifting the way that they're doing fisheries management. And we're also seeing growing concern about climate change and then the long-term energy demand and the market availability for projects like these. And so anecdotal evidence that we've seen in both Laos and Myanmar shows that China is starting to pull back funding from some of these projects that are being most risky or least economically feasible. In China, there are, many of you have probably heard of the Viet Sông Dam, which is a large dam on the Irrigation River in the northern part of Myanmar. That was only one of a cascade of 7 projects, and since that project was suspended for political reasons, the other 6 projects, the funding for those has been withheld by the China Export-Import Bank because they don't want to move forward with any projects until they think that they're not going to be facing significant political risk. And we also have anecdotal evidence of this happening to projects in Laos, many smaller tributary projects which are potentially on the margin of what would be viewed as economically feasible or were viewed as just too risky for management in the long term. Those projects are now also facing financial difficulty with Chinese banks and financiers not wanting to provide the funding, although they had signed initial interest agreements earlier. So this also ties in with concern over longer-term energy demand, which is the largest factor and is a significant part of our report. And it's just the question of whether or not Laos is going to be overbuilding the number of projects for the energy demand in the energy market in the region. What we've heard is that because of the other risks associated with the projects, in the end, Laos is likely to only get 5 of the 9 mainstream hydropower projects. So that would be Don Sahong and then the projects north of Vientiane. And that fits with what we've seen in development trajectory for rivers in other developed countries. Oftentimes, if you look at rivers that are considered fully exploited for hydropower, they often only have between 40 and 70% of the proposed projects that ended up actually getting built. For the same reasons that we mentioned before, just with risk of management, economic feasibility, and other challenges. And so the question here is looking at Laos, if they are not going to get more than 40 to 70% of the projects, how is that going to impact their planning? because as Brian mentioned, they have so far gone through a project by project approach. There's no goal in the end for how much energy they actually want to get out. They're just going full steam ahead with as many projects as they can and assuming that they're going to have an energy market that is ready and willing to pay the prices for those individual projects. And it's undoubtable that there is significant energy demand growth in Southeast Asia. It's projected, when you look at just per capita energy use right now in Southeast Asia, it's very low. Laos, for average, only uses about 500 kilowatt hours per year. Vietnam uses about 1,300 per capita kilowatt hours per year. Thailand is at close to 2,500, and then if you look at China, that's about 4,000. So you can see significant variance and see that there is significant opportunity for growth and there's unmet demand for energy through many of these countries. However, moving back to the energy demand context for mainland Southeast Asia, there are questions. Myanmar is currently buying electricity from Laos, or is interested in buying electricity from Laos on the Shan State. And they have need for electricity because, as we mentioned before, they're fairly underdeveloped. Only about 30% of the people have access to an electricity grid there. So there are significant short-term needs, and they are likely to purchase electricity from Laos in the next decade. However, in the long term, because of their significant potential, they're likely to be a competitor for Laos rather than a purchaser in a market. Thailand is currently the primary purchaser of power for Laos, and that's due to domestic challenges in Thailand with their energy. 64% of their energy supply currently comes from natural gas, much of which is domestically produced, but some of which is imported. And for Thailand, they're seeking to diversify that, and that's been the driving factor for investments in coal and in hydropower. And because of the environmental concerns and laws in Thailand, they tend to invest abroad. Previously, this has primarily been in Laos, and in the future, that will likely be in Myanmar. But one caveat with Thailand's energy demand is that it's largely driven by the Electrical Generating Authority of Thailand, EGAT, which has historic tendencies to significantly overestimate the amount of energy that's needed for Thailand. They have incentive to do this because the way the EGAT works is that they have a fixed rate of return on any investment for energy. So no matter how many projects they move forward with, they're always going to be getting a certain amount of money plowed back into EGAT. And so that incentivizes some overcapacity planning. And the reserve amount for the current power development plan moving forward ranges between 20% at a low and 39% at a high. So that means they've got 39% more energy built into their plans than they actually need. And that is only accounting for projects that are already moving forward and already have MOUs. That's not including projects that are not yet on the books, although this power development plan goes for at least the next decade. So as we can see, there's significant potential that Thailand's energy demand, and which Laos is counting on as a primary purchaser for most of its hydropower, may not ultimately be there. And the other aspect of that as well.
Can I add into that maybe you're getting to it, Courtney, sorry to interrupt, but the king's passing in Thailand is something that is going to shock the Thai economy for years to come and send political and economic shock waves throughout the country and through the region as well. So we think this is something that's spelled negative economic opportunities for Thailand, which will have an effect on energy demand.
Yeah, energy in Thailand has, if you look historically, it's tracked relatively closely with economic growth. So you saw dips in the 1997 financial crisis, you saw a dip in 2008, and it's likely that there will be some impacts in the next few years. Apart from that as well is just the opportunity for energy efficiency in Thailand is pretty significant. Estimates range between 9% and 27% of the energy demand could be saved if Thailand were to implement energy efficiency. And in the past, the pricing of energy had made it not necessarily, there had not been much motivation for individual households or the industry to necessarily conserve energy or move and invest in energy efficiency. But that's starting to shift as energy prices rise. So shifting to the other countries in the region, I'll very briefly talk about Cambodia. They similarly have a very low electrification rate like Myanmar, it's only about 30%. They already depend on imports, largely for diesel fuel. And Cambodia also pays one of the highest tariffs in ASEAN as a whole for energy. In 2012, it was in urban areas about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. In some rural areas, it was 80 cents a kilowatt hour. That's dropped a little bit in the last couple of years as a few smaller hydropower projects have come on as a baseload energy for Cambodia. But overall, they still pay much higher than most of the surrounding countries for kilowatt hour. And so there's significant potential for them to import, for instance, hydropower from Laos, which sells at around 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. However, Cambodia has significant national security concerns about importing most of its electricity, and since they have some hydropower domestically, then that's really more focused, so they're not likely in the near term to be a major importer of Lao hydropower. China, similarly, is not going to be a major importer of Lao hydropower because the region of China that's closest to Lao has also significant solar, wind, and hydropower potential. So they actually have a glut right now, and that's likely to continue into the near future as they build out their non-hydropower renewables. And so they're just not going to be a purchaser. In fact, the transmission lines that cross the border between Laos and China are often actually used to import electricity from China. So ultimately, getting to the point that's probably of most interest to everyone here, that leads to Vietnam as a potential market. As Brian mentioned earlier, the electricity demand in Vietnam is rising significantly. For the last decade, it's usually been between 10 and 12% demand growth a year. In the future, that's still anticipated to be between 7 and 10% electricity demand growth. And notably, that is also not including any potential benefits from the TPP, if that moves forward, or from a significant shift of industry away from China and down to Vietnam because of the lower labor prices here, which acts as an attractant. And so there's the potential for that to shift upwards. Now, I know that many of you are probably familiar with the Power Development Plan. That does not include a significant amount of hydropower import from Laos. It looks to include about 2% of Vietnam's need through 2020, about 860 megawatts. And instead, we're seeing a shift within Vietnam to build out the coal industry agreement. And so that price shift opens the door to Vietnam potentially purchasing power, hydropower, or other power from Laos. Because Lao imports for hydropower currently stand between 6 and 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And that also could put over to solar, because solar stands currently around 7.2 cents a kilowatt hour. And in Laos, or in Vietnam, that can actually be made significantly cheaper in the near term by partnering with hydropower, because one of the largest challenges with Lao hydropower, apart from the pricing and the lack of infrastructure built out, is that it is not necessarily considered reliable. Hydropower is most efficient during the wet season. You have a lot of water available, and less efficient during the dry season. But solar would actually complement that quite well, because solar is most efficient during the dry season. So if you put those two projects together, it actually becomes very feasible to invest in solar right now, and more so in the future because the price of solar is expected to drop. So looking at those broader energy trends, it seems very feasible that Vietnam could be a significant market for Lao power. And I will turn it back over to Brian.
We'll make it fast.
And I'll conclude with some final statements of strategies and ways to go about energy cooperation between Vietnam and Laos, and from the donor community to Laos. So there's two strategies. One, and it's quite controversial, it's for Vietnam to purchase more power from us. This does not mean necessarily more dams. This does not mean purchasing of hydropower from us. What it means is it's an economic olive branch to Laos to say we are interested in satisfying our demand in Vietnam by buying power from you if you can go about this in a strategic way that doesn't ruin the Mekong Delta and does not devastate our agricultural areas. So that is done in two ways. One, where the projects are to avoid the most damaging projects and to continue to avoid damming the mainstream and to promote this, because the mainstream dams we feel have the greatest effect on the Mekong Delta. But also to think strategically about damming tributaries. For example, the Mekong River is a river that originates in Vietnam, flows through Laos and Cambodia. Currently there are no dams on the mainstream. And that river the flows that come out of the river because of its downstream or southern orientation in the river will be extremely critical to delivering sediment and fish and other environmental flows to the Mekong Delta and Cambodia. Keeping that river undammed is important for the future of this country, arguably for the region as well. If Vietnam were to approach damming Laos damming plans for the Mekong in a purely diplomatic manner, then we feel there are a few teeth to that approach. There are a few effective uses of that approach, but buying more power and investing not just in hydropower, smart hydropower or sustainable hydropower, but also investing in solar and investing in other forms of renewable energy in Laos is kind of a win-win situation. And the second strategy is something that Laos needs very much, and that's a national power grid that is effective and effectively connected from the north to the south of the country and plugged into the region. Laos currently does not have this. Its power grid is being built out in a very piecemeal, step-by-step fashion, not by the country itself, but by developers who are building dams. So this is resulting in a very substandard, we would use the word haphazard, risky way of building a national power grid, and one that is uncoordinated. If the Asian Development Bank, if the AIIB, China has, or another outside financial institution, donor bank, could fund and provide the right terms for a national power grid, this is a way forward for Laos to build fewer dams, do more with what it has, and provide a flexible solution to these kind of dynamic swings of energy demand that Courtney talked about. If Thailand is low, but more dams are oriented towards Thailand, with the grid, when Vietnam needs more power, power can be transmitted from the north all the way to the south and into Vietnam. Currently we don't have that. Currently there's no connection between the north and the south. So a grid is a good solution for flexibility, fewer dams, and fewer damage. But to date, the Lao government has not asked for this. So these are two strategies that we think will be useful to promoting a more sustainable future in the Mekong and a more sustainable future in Vietnam. And we're looking forward to discussing these strategies and the points made in our presentation. Thank you.